Sunday night. August 15th, 1971. Millions of Americans are sitting in front of their televisions waiting for the hit Western show Bonanza to start. Instead, the screen cuts to the Oval Office. President Richard Nixon stares into the camera and announces a temporary suspension of the convertibility of the dollar into gold. He tells the public this action is necessary to defend the dollar against international speculators. He promises that your dollar will be worth just as much tomorrow as it is today. That promise was false. In a matter of minutes, a foundational pillar of global finance collapsed. Nixon severed the tether that forced governments to physically back their money with hard assets. Most historians point to this night as the dawn of the modern Fiat era, but they fundamentally misunderstand what was actually happening in that room. The men who gathered at Camp David that weekend, including Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, a man constantly puffing on a pipe while deflecting blame, and Treasury Undersecretary Paul Volcker, a tall, imposing figure who would later have to clean up the ensuing mess, were not fixing a broken system. They were executing the oldest trick in the Book of Governance. The Treasury Secretary at the time, John Connolly, possessed a blunt arrogance about the maneuver. He would soon look foreign finance ministers in the eye and tell them the dollar is our currency, but it is your problem. Most people think inflation is just prices going up. But for the vast majority of human history, inflation meant something completely different, and the reason that definition changed is one of the most important stories in economics that almost nobody tells. This is the true origin of inflation, what historians get wrong, and why a rising cost of living has never been a technical malfunction. It is a feature of the system. To understand how we arrived at a point where a central bank can print trillions of dollars from thin air, we have to travel back to the exact moment a sovereign authority realized they could lie about the money itself. The year is 211. The Roman Empire is beginning to fracture under the weight of its own borders. Emperor Caracalla sits on the throne. He has a massive problem. The Roman legionnaires demand higher pay to continue border kinetic action against Germanic tribes. Caracalla cannot raise taxes on the patrician class without risking assassination. He needs money he does not possess. His solution is brutally simple. He recalls the silver denarius, the standard coin of the empire, for centuries. When the mint strikes the new coins, they do not contain the same amount of silver. Caracalla's metallurgists melt base metals, mostly copper, into the silver supply. He introduces a new coin called the Antoninianus. It is officially valued at 2 denarii, but it contains only 1.5 times the silver. It is a brilliant, invisible tax. The state spends this new debased currency to pay the soldiers. The soldiers spend it in the markets. For a brief window, everything seems fine. But soon, the merchants notice the coins feel lighter. They lack the distinct ring of pure silver when dropped on a stone table. The merchants do what any rational actor would do. They demand more coins for a sack of grain. Prices rise. Modern textbooks label this price inflation, but the original definition of the word inflation was strictly the artificial expansion of the currency supply. The inflation happened inside the mint. The price increases in the Roman markets were simply the unavoidable terminal outcome. Successive emperors repeated Caracalla's tactic, turning a slow bleed into a fatal hemorrhage. By the late 3rd century, the silver content of Roman coins dropped to less than 5%. A measure of wheat that cost half a denarius in the 1st century cost 100,000 denarii by the reign of Emperor Diocletian. Diocletian tried to solve the crisis by issuing the edict on maximum prices in the year 301. He carved lists into stone monuments across the empire, dictating exactly what a pound of beef or a pair of boots must cost, and he mandated execution for any merchant who disobeyed. It failed completely. Merchants simply hid their goods. Black markets thrived. Entire towns starved because farmers refused to bring grain to a market where the money was worthless. You cannot decree the value of a debased currency. The physical reality of the metal dictates the terms. We see this identical physical reality assert itself during the Spanish Price Revolution, though historians fiercely debate the exact mechanics. In the 16th century, Spanish galleons began returning from the New World loaded with silver mined from Potosi, a massive peak known as the Mountain That Eats Men, located in modern-day Bolivia. Thousands of tons of precious metal flooded into the ports of Seville. According to the foundational thesis published by economic historian Earl Hamilton in 1934, who spent years examining hospital price records in Andalusia, this sudden massive increase in the European money supply triggered a century of relentless price hikes. A loaf of bread in Spain quadrupled in cost. Wages failed to keep pace, leaving laborers destitute. Hamilton argued this was the first documented case of global inflation driven purely by an external supply shock of money. However, modern historians like Michel Moreneau counter that population growth and urbanization played a much larger role in driving up demand for scarce resources, arguing that Hamilton overstated the single cause of the money supply. The debate is vital because it exposes a persistent framing error. The Spanish crown used the silver to fund endless continental wars. The Spanish kings, Philip II and Philip III, spent the silver before it circulated into the broader economy. By the time the metal reached the peasants in the form of higher prices, the crown had already extracted the purchasing power. This leads directly into a 300-year-old insight that explains who actually wins when money is created. In the early 18th century, an Irish banker named Richard Cantillon wrote a manuscript titled Essay on the Nature of Trade in General. Cantillon was a shadowy, brilliant figure. He made a fortune shorting the Mississippi Company financial bubble in France, knowing exactly when the paper money system would collapse. He was eventually murdered in his London home in 1734 by a disgruntled former cook who set the house on fire to cover up the robbery. But before his terminal outcome, Cantillon documented a mechanism that modern central banks prefer you ignore. It is known today as the Cantillon Effect. Cantillon observed that newly created money does not enter an economy evenly, like water filling a bathtub. It enters at a specific point. The first receivers of the new money, usually the government and heavily connected financial institutions, get to spend it before prices rise in the broader economy. They buy assets, labor, and goods at yesterday's prices. As that money slowly moves through the system, from bankers to merchants to ordinary workers, it drives prices up. By the time the newly created money reaches the average citizen in the form of wages, the cost of living has already skyrocketed. The Cantillon effect proves that inflation is a massive structural transfer of wealth from the last in line to the first in line. It erodes the savings of ordinary people to subsidize the debts of the powerful. There is no starker example of this wealth transfer than Weimar Germany in 1923. Following the first global conflict, the German government owed massive war reparations in gold and foreign currency. But they also had a domestic crisis. French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr Valley to extract coal and steel by force. The German government ordered the local workers to go on strike and promised to pay their wages to resist the occupation. The head of the Reichsbank, Rudolf Havenstein, faced an impossible problem. He had no tax revenue to pay the striking workers. So he turned on the printing presses. At first it was a slow trickle. Then it became an avalanche. Historians often portray Havenstein as a fool who simply did not understand monetary mechanics. This is a profound misreading of history. Havenstein knew exactly what he was doing. He was choosing the lesser of two immediate evils. He printed money to avoid outright state collapse and mass starvation, knowing it would destroy the currency. By November 1923, the printing presses were running day and night, consuming tons of ink and paper. Prices doubled every few days. A single loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. Workers demanded to be paid twice a day, so they could rush to the store and buy food before the exchange rate changed by afternoon. The Weimar hyperinflation wiped out the entire German middle class in a matter of months. People who had saved their whole lives in government bonds were suddenly impoverished, burning bundles of cash in their stoves just to stay warm because it was cheaper than buying firewood. But the Weimar inflation also created massive winners. Hugo Stinnes, a ruthless German industrialist, borrowed massive amounts of marks from the central bank, used them to buy real factories, coal mines, and shipping lines, and then paid back his loans weeks later with worthless paper. Stinnes became the wealthiest man in Germany. The debt evaporated. The hard assets remained. Inflation always rewards the heavily indebted owner of assets at the expense of the prudent saver. It took a new currency, the Rentenmark, introduced by Hjalmar Schacht, backed by the theoretical value of all German land, to finally break the psychological fever of hyperinflation, which brings us back to the post-1971 Fiat system. Once the gold constraint was completely removed, governments could expand the money supply indefinitely. But to do this without triggering an immediate political revolt, the very definition of inflation had to be quietly changed. In the first half of the 20th century, every major dictionary defined inflation as an increase in the money supply. By the late 20th century, the definition had shifted to a rise in consumer prices. This semantic trick is crucial. It shifts the blame. If inflation is an expanding money supply, the central bank and the government are entirely responsible for printing it. If inflation is just prices going up, politicians can blame greedy corporations, supply chain bottlenecks, or foreign wars. To maintain this illusion, the government relies on the Consumer Price Index. Economists insist the CPI accurately measures the cost of living. But the index was never designed to capture the full consequences of monetary expansion. In 1996, the Boskin Commission explicitly sought to alter the CPI methodology to lower the official inflation rate, which would save the government billions in cost of living adjustments for Social Security. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, commissions constantly tweaked the methodology to produce lower official numbers. They introduced hedonic adjustments. If the price of a television goes up, but the screen is larger and clearer, the government statisticians log a price decrease, claiming you are getting more quality for your dollar, even though you must surrender more cash at the register. They introduced substitution. If the price of beef gets too high and consumers are forced to buy cheaper chicken, the basket of goods is swapped, hiding the loss of purchasing power and forcing a lower standard of living onto the dataset without registering a price spike. The CPI systematically underreports the actual pain felt by the working class. It ignores the cost of financing a home or the exploding price of finite assets like land, fine art, and stock portfolios, which is exactly where the newly printed money pools up under the Cantillon Effect. We see this today with quantitative easing, where central banks purchase trillions in mortgage-backed securities and government bonds, injecting liquidity directly into the financial sector while ordinary wages stagnate. This is the hidden history of inflation. From Caracalla clipping silver in Rome, to the Spanish kings blowing their New World silver on endless wars, to Havenstein running the Weimar presses into oblivion, to the modern central banking system executing quantitative easing. The common thread is debt. When a sovereign entity accumulates more debt than it can possibly repay through taxation, it always resorts to debasing the currency. Historians who treat inflation as a mysterious psychological phenomenon or an accidental failure of monetary policy are misreading the evidence. It is a targeted, deliberate policy choice. It is a quiet default. The wealth does not disappear. It merely changes hands, floating steadily upward to the first receivers of the new money. As we look at the exploding sovereign debt levels across the globe today, the question isn't whether governments will print more money to cover their obligations. The only question is how fast they will do it, and who will be left holding the bag. What do you think is the real true rate of inflation today compared to the official numbers? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you want to understand exactly how modern banking institutions use this system to extract wealth, make sure to hit that subscribe button for our next investigation into the shadow banking sector.